All right, I don't know about y'all, but my heart is feeling so full. My mind is going so many places. It's really hard for me to be in this present moment because I'm like all the ways in which this work is being brought to life and the ways in which we can collaborate and build together. I'm just so impressed and so excited, and really honored to open up this space for our next round of presentations. So welcome to room 4, Models for Grief Processing. And so today we are going to have 2 presentations, not 3 in this session, because we have 2 folks working together to share their work. Up first is Canada. I just want to say for folks that don't know me yet, my name is Oriana Ides. I'm a field coach with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. And as we are listening to the powerful work that our community is presenting, I invite you in the chat to share your appreciations, to share words and feelings that are affirming to you that you hear surfaced, to share your inquiry and your own personal connections to the work that you see. Let's get the chat live and poppin'. So first off is Canada Taylor Parker, Collective Grief, Collective Transformation. We're in for a treat with this. I hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you all so much. This is the first time I've felt nervous in a long time. And when I actually did this, there were hundreds of people in the room. So that tells you something about this. So it's really good to see all of you. And thank you all who came for support today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Canada Taylor Parker. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And I work in suicide prevention at the county level. I do work that supports our region. I do work that's outside of my regular job just because I feel so passionate about healing and community and transformation. I'm also have a background in death care. I've been in behavioral health for a really long time, but I took a little pause from that when I was widowed really unexpectedly and became a funeral celebrant and a death doula and actually really started my little urban farm and got goats. And so I come to this with my whole self, and that's really what I want to bring out in everyone else. That in creating this process, I really wanted to make this a space of vulnerability for people to kind of share their own experiences and lean into who they are in the most radically loving and vibrant ways possible. So this is really focused on liberation work. I believe all of our work is really focused on liberation, that when we bring healing and wellness to people, when we bring joy and abundance and opportunity for growth and healing to create spaces for that, we really are liberating everyone. And so with that, move to the next slide. So for this capstone, I had so many questions about what does my community need? What can I offer? And frequently the questions I experience and doing post-vention response work for my county is that people are figuring out how to make this all make sense in terms of even their approaches to things, that often we have piecemeal parts of what happens. So if a death happens and it's gun violence, somebody does this. If a death happens and it's suicide, somebody does this. If something really traumatic happens in the school or the workplace, there's this other process. And sometimes it really doesn't touch everyone who's impacted. It doesn't consider some of the bigger questions. And so someone mentioned in this process, often we create the things we need. And this is really this process came from. And so to tell this story, so I had a lot of different ways I envisioned it. And the place this ended up being is out in Eastern Oregon for an educators conference that I made a really brief presentation about this much bigger work. And so what I did to really help this make sense for people is that I used the story of Addie Straub. And for those of you who are not from Oregon, you may not know the story of Addie, but Addie was a transgender student who attended high school here in Portland. And she was loved and supported by her family and friends, but also experienced a lot of bullying, a lot of pain, a lot of sorrow, a lot of isolation, and wrote about her mental health struggles in a school paper, which was graded, checked for spelling and grammar, and then returned. And nothing was ever spoken to a social worker, a therapist, a counselor, or the family. And she died by suicide within a month of that. Her family, in that process of their grief, really leaned into the transformation for the community, knowing that Addie and so many other students are students who are living because of who they are in this world, experiencing harm from others, and that this is impacting their mental health. and adding to suicide. And so I really wanted to bring in that intimate story because I'm a big believer in storytelling, not just because I'm a funeral celebrant, but I wanted to make sense in a way that people get it in their bones. And that's really my hope was with this model. My hope is to take this model and kind of help explore not only the individual impacts of the sorrow and the trauma that often we focus on, but about the bigger pieces around us, that no matter what bureaucracy we work in, we tend to believe that we're a silo that's self-contained and has all of the answers. And I really wanted to challenge that with this model, to make our educators, to make those people who work in government silos, to make our community look at all of how we all are connected and interconnected. Okay, next slide. So this is the model that I extracted from to create this model. This is from the University of Minnesota. It's based on the ecology of human development. And it's a socio-ecological model that I love because it really explicitly names all of the different levels of things that are happening. This really spoke to me because often in our area, there are combinations of factors that the people who are dying by suicide or experiencing a lot of harm are typically people who are people of color, people who have queer trans identities, people who are experiencing foster care houselessness, people who have economic insecurity as adults, people who are often marginalized, or people who are part of the global majority. And so I wanted to name what does that look like, to look at our liberation and look at our healing, and really name what that is. But often to kind of do that work, we need to name explicitly every single piece of that. I want it to be clear for everyone in the journey. So that's why I love this model, because it really names this. It brings in a lot of the social determinants of health and the 4 realms of ACEs. So we're really talking about all the different impacts from environmental to society, to what those soils are that are growing in those communities, and really naming that for people. And so I made my baby model, and that's the next slide here. And so what I did was I really didn't want to give anybody a paper with that many pieces of language in it because it's a lot to look at. But I wanted to really explain it using questions, using discourse and a process of inquiry to get people to think about what does it mean. And so this is how I explained it to people, talking about those adverse community experiences really clearly, because often we are sitting in those, whether it is that we have targeted racism that's been happening in events in our schools, whether we see an uprising in which there are different types of hate crimes, whether we are experiencing the social determinants of health because of the economics in the area. Sometimes we talk about children in our area that because of the housing crisis on the West Coast in general, we have children who are stepping over houseless people to get to their schools, who are seeing and witnessing drug use on the streets. This is a part of the context that we sit in. And so I wanted to really bring all of that into picture really closely. I also want to use this model to talk about also those protective factors and how culture is a protective factor for people. And so every part of this, in asking these questions and naming this, I did want to actually get people to think about how are people experiencing this world in ways that are actually protecting them, that are helpful and healing for them. And then we move to the next slide. And so I wanted to say, yes, we can talk about harms or experiences in the system, but what's healing us, and how to use this lens to focus on what our healing is. I know in my own work, often I have to interrupt and perhaps disrupt processes that are happening to actually get us to talk about what healing looks like. And so we know at the individual level, this is what we have the most of our lenses on. Like, yes, I need to get grief groups. I need this person to get therapy. We need to do what we can to support them and being safe in the community. But often when it moves up to that bigger collective level is where we kind of lose track of what might make a difference. And so asking people, having them ask questions like, what does our organization do to be responsible and adaptable? Or how do our community organizations actually work within all the different layers of what's happening in our community? Society, in telling Addie's story, it was a great opportunity to talk about how this one family and this one little girl who was precious and loved being a sibling and loved her parents and loved being in community and was artistic and creative, from her death, from this immense loss and bereavement of this family, they really helped to transform the state of Oregon. And because Oregon continues to transform, we impact other states around us, that this impact on policy actually really will eventually have a greater societal effect as we see more and more states domino into what they want to do to really make a change in terms of youth suicide. And so I really wanted people to ask themselves questions and really consider this model, not because it's going to be something you look at and it's concrete and it just has all the answers, but for them to ask questions and be challenged to think about who they haven't talked about, who is in the room, who could be in that room, what healing is actually happening that we haven't tapped into because we're so focused on this one space in which we think this is where healing happens. So this is really a model for discourse, for inquiry, for challenge, and for us to make sure that we are actually elevating the voices of those who can often be unseen and unheard in those power rooms where decisions are made. Next slide. Because in all of this, and I really have a way of talking about this, going to be very geeky and very sciencey about this model, but I really love this quote from Hafiz when he says, "An awake heart is like a sky that pours light." I want everyone's heart to open into this work, even though I know that we create processes and we create policies, that this has to be something that's centered in our heart and connected to our real experiences as whole humans, not as partial people, not as just a policy person or just a classroom teacher. We often have a way of saying just a. You are just a this. We are, none of us are that. We are everything and more. And I wanted people to really realize that and think about themselves and also who we care for and who we serve in our community. In the process of this, there are more tools that I am creating from this. So though technically I am done, I'm not done. This is living work with me. We'll continue to go on. I'm creating a facilitation model around this, so that way I can actually help walk people from this phase to the next phase. And I'll be leaning on some of my other fellows who have some amazing work. This has really been a great space to really bring up intentional equity and liberation and integrate it into postvention work, and acknowledging that sometimes I talk to groups who aren't ready for that, but they're still hearing the language, and I'm really kind of helping them understand and maybe leading from the back of the room in a way in which they can hear it differently, and really start to think about these concepts. And I want to continue to refine this working with community. For my own leadership journey, it's been hard because I hold myself to really high standards for this. And so I've really had to challenge those dominant cultural norms that I often do in the spaces in which I may be leading our team. But it's hard for me to do personally, which is slowing down and acknowledging that there's only so much work I can do at a time. And I'm actively in the work all the time. Really creating intentional space for thought partners, and co-leading and reinventing this work together. And really stepping into my own leadership and confidence, and knowing that I do have something in my voice to share, and knowing this year I'm really taking more risks, and this has really helped me grow just personally, feel more comfortable in my own space in this work, and knowing there is a space for me in this work, as this fellowship has made that space. And really, this fellowship, everyone just leads with an open heart, and it feels so grounded and so safe. And so I've just been thankful for this learning experience and thankful to create with others. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you all for listening to that. Thank you all for being here and support today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I invite folks to share in the chat your appreciation for Canada, for her work, for her wisdom and stories, for the reflection that she's offering. It was quite powerful for me to see all of the realms of the ecological model addressed in your 10 minutes, and the ways in which they're all in direct interplay with one another. Yesterday, I heard the term practice-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based practice, and I saw that come alive in your work as well right now. So thank you so, so much. Please share in the chat what it is you heard, what you're leaving this segment with as we transition into our next two. So here's a collab effort. This is Kirsta and Christine together. So we'll have 20 minutes. And again, as you're listening, please share questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to be in dialogue as a full group.
Okay. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. Christine and I chose to focus on the areas of courage and renewal in our project. And our guiding question was, how can we provide staff the opportunity to experience the steps from recovery to renewal for themselves in some fashion following a crisis? We both work in schools, and so we've both seen firsthand how educators work through crisis and grief and keep going and keep going. And we wanted to envision something different. What if we could hold space for ourselves and each other and empower school staff? And we mean anybody who works in schools, we included as educators. How can we empower them to feel like they can lead healing spaces for students? That Canada said, we often say we're just you know, that they're not feeling like I'm just a teacher. I'm not a therapist. I can't hold space for others to debrief and process their grief. We wanted them to feel like they could do that while also protecting their own boundaries. And so we called it Staff Resilience and Debrief, holding space for yourself through boundaries, sharing, and integration. And we made a video how-to guide. We took the publication from SCRR, which is called Creating the Container, Designing Collective Rituals to Metabolize Grief Together as a School, Team, Community, and Culture. And that's a publication guide that's available to anyone on the website. We took that and we personalized it. We broke it down into some teaching points, and then we made a video that talked through how we would use that, how it reflected the parts of ourselves that we brought to our work, and then how we saw our roles as supporting that kind of work in schools. Next slide, Christine. Oh, I'm slide 2 too. This is who we are. I was a teacher for about 25 years, mostly in 4th and 5th grades and middle and high school math. And the reason that I'm drawn to this work is that the most compelling part to me of a classroom is making it a safe place for students. I always think that the academic piece is secondary. And so when trauma-informed became language that was shared, I was really drawn to that, as well as equity and the effects of poverty on learning. I trained as a crisis response team member early in my career. And then, like Canada, I was suddenly widowed when my children were small. And so I became very passionate about grief work and support then. And what I value and bring to our project is authenticity in our work. And I hope to encourage others to be vulnerable as well. Christine?
Hi, everyone. So grateful that y'all took time to be here today. We know that there's probably a million other things that you quote unquote should be doing. And yet we are so grateful that you took the time to slow down, breathe, and just check in with what you need. We wanted to take a moment to share who we are because we show up in the work that we do and wherever our story leads us. So I'm Christine Ewing. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the community of Bend, Oregon, and I'm also a credentialed school counselor at Bend Senior High. Go Bears! And then I also have the honor and privilege of serving the community for crisis response and also to train for suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. I am a proud Lebanese Egyptian American who has lived experience with grief, but particularly when it comes to disenfranchised grief for most of my life, as well as both loss, accumulated loss in both my personal and professional worlds. Today, I am sharing with you from the lens as a therapist in the community, as well as my perspective as a school counselor, with raging courage as a champion for grief and healing in a framework where boundaries are expanded, but not broken, right? As well as hope for interrupting the taboo of societal and cultural norms that surround grief. I'm working now as an advocate to unlearn the many years of cultural conditioning and shame surrounding grief and loss for me personally, and just what I was taught in school and in training, which in full transparency has been quite challenging for me as a part of this fellowship because I have to consciously make a choice to shift my mindset of always having it together and being there for others to actually slowing down and saying, wait a minute, I am also human and I can be a walking testimony of what grief can look like and also what hope and resiliency can look like without breaking who I am, but humanizing that our experience can happen collectively.
This slide is from Trauma Transform and was shared with us as part of the internship. And it's what we saw our project as helping schools to do, to going from trauma organized, where everything's reactive, it's fragmented, through trauma informed, which is where a lot of us sit. We have the shared language, we fundamentally understand what trauma is, and all the way up to becoming healing organizations where we can make meaning out of the past, where we can grow, where we can reflect together, and that our approaches to holding space for ourselves and each other serve as trauma shielding or trauma reducing. Because we both work in schools, we know that schools are fragmented or reactive because of all the demands placed upon them. And so when a crisis becomes something else to bring onto the plate, the crisis response can become avoidant or numbing or fragmented as well. And we hope that if we can show how teachers, educators, school members can come together and reflect and collaborate and grow, if we can show that that's possible and doable, we hope that people will feel brave enough to give themselves this time and space they need to be vulnerable together and integrate grief into their lives. I also think that another point that we felt passionately about was that healing work doesn't have to be therapy. It's part of the reason that Christine and I paired up. She's a therapist, I'm not. And so I feel comfortable holding a space for people in schools, not because I'm providing therapy. I'm not qualified for that or trained, but I can bring a therapeutic space. I do have the skills to do that because I use this guide and looked at this guide, but also because we can do that in and of ourselves. We can help each other and sit with each other in crisis. Next slide.
So Kirsta and I want to invite you to think about your past and current policies and procedures surrounding crisis response, debriefing, and even healing. And that's really what we want to focus on. We encourage you to reflect on what your current protocols are in crisis response, and perhaps just get a little curious to understand why those current policies may not allow for grief to heal in the unfolding of the daily routines and the movement forward after a crisis. We know that grief is not a new concept, right? That grief and loss have been a part of this work in education since the beginning of time. And we also know that most often we as educators don't question traditional policies because that's just the way it's always been. Yet we also know that we are human, and whether a policy exists or not, we are still going to have feelings arise with the notion of these expectations to grieve in a particular timeline. In fact, in most states, we've got about 1 to 3 days to grieve, and then that's it. So we are hoping for you and for this resource to hold a space for a current paradox, that while we have professional protocols to follow, we are human in both our professional and our personal worlds. And both being human and processing in a professional setting can coexist.
Part of what we do in our presentation is talk about that paradox and encourage the people using our guide to take a deeper dive into how these opposing forces sometimes can impact them, and to give permission to unlearn and grow through self-reflection with questions like, what if you let go of what you were taught? What if you let go of what you were trained in school to do? What if you let go of the adherence to the policies that have always been and learned a new way to allow grief to make itself present so that trauma doesn't become inevitable? We've learned that trauma always carries grief, but not every grief has to carry trauma, and that we cannot heal what we do not feel. So through grief, we can get through grief by grieving, and that was what we hope to share with our product. Thanks, Christine. Next slide.
So we recognize that every single person comes in with different lived experiences, different levels of comfort when it comes to naming, expressing, and processing feelings around grief. The same is true to boundaries in both professional and personal settings. So the question then becomes, how do we hold space for each other as we integrate grief into part of who we are and the work that we do? We know that wherever we go, there we are, right? And that's whether we're at work, with family and friends, or just within ourselves. We also know that humans are innately designed to connect with one another. And we especially know that we need others to learn, to grow, and to heal. So if we can create a supported space where we can listen to one another's story, not fix, not give a silver lining, but just listen, then we can learn ways that our minds and our bodies can process to allow our grief to have breath, to be seen, and to be held. Then we can shift from just recovery to renewal in all aspects of our lives. As we move into details of how this could look in your setting, we want to remind folks that we are not asking you to become the trained mental health professional. If you're not one, we're not asking you, if you are a trained mental health professional, to be the therapist for everybody to lean on, right? Because that is not healing and healthy for you or for anybody around. This resource, as Kirsta mentioned, is meant to be a therapeutic resource, but not therapy. We are simply offering some ways for you to unlearn everything that held you back from grieving and being, and just connecting with others in times of need. Next slide.
A page from our presentation, and I just wanted to put it up because I think as we're talking, you can hear that we have very strong philosophical ideas about what grief is and can be. But in our video, we do give logistical tools, and this was a place where we talk through each of them. And our hope is that crisis leadership becomes or feels accessible to people who feel its pull. Because each situation is unique and there's not a right way to grieve, if we build on our own strengths, we can bring what our community needs. We provide examples, for instance, of a healing circle to offer a tool for support that gives some structure. And I hope that will allow people to feel more comfortable in creating a brave space for themselves and others. We go into detail about each of these elements in our video so we can better support their needs and understanding.
All right, so after considering some of the elements that Kirsta just shared, we want to offer you a format. And this is really just an overview visual of what could be some starting points that you can take, mold, adapt, permanently borrow, permanently steal, make it your own. We are here for that. And really quickly, we're going to go through this because we want to get into the goods, right? Armor off, vulnerability in. But the first part is just laying the foundation. We want to set an intention and a purpose. So no matter the setting, our hope is that you set the purpose for your gathering, welcome folks into the space, acknowledge the name and the purpose of the gathering, agree on the purpose, and then allow for genuineness to show up for any person, regardless of lived experience, comfort, or boundaries. And then we want to be able to ground in that gathering space. As we mentioned earlier, right? Trauma and grief often go hand in hand. And so we know that research shows us that when our minds cannot make sense of our grief, our bodies certainly can and will. Any other folks in the room relate to that? Just me? Okay, great. It's actually a protective factor, y'all. And so it's meant to be a strength. So we want to acknowledge that. We want to give it space to breathe and to actually have an opportunity to heal. We want to ground folks in either breathing practices, body scans, or a combination of both. And we again want to acknowledge that that might vary depending on their level of comfort and even ability. So it's really just what feels best for everyone in the room. But we want to name that not everyone syncs at the same time, and that's okay. The goal is just to have some present, focused mindfulness. And mindfulness is a word that I have had to come back to a lot because mindfulness is really just paying attention without judgment. And let me tell y'all, I will be the first to judge everything that my mind says and then everything that comes out of my mouth. So the idea of just sitting in that space without judgment has been a new, uncomfortably comfortable concept for me to lean into this year. And then the third part is the round of storytelling. Facilitators can either lead this through setting the example or just by repetitive checking in to ensure that everyone has shared to their comfort level, whether it's through directed prompts, wonderings, grapplings, cravings, or supports for accountability and healing. And then we just recognize that when we're able to create a space for belonging, we can actually interrupt what gets in the way of healing. Because being able to name the grapplings that we are experiencing actually allows us to tame and have some ownership of our grief versus continuing to shame it and not talk about it. And then lastly, we want to be able to have some closure towards hope. We can do that by naming the intention of containerizing that space, providing opportunities for courage to continue growing, because we know that courage is not the absence of fear, but it's doing something despite the fear. And when we're given a chance to tell our story or to make meaning of our story, then we're actually moving away from recovery and into renewal. Regardless of how it goes, we want to take care of ourselves by having continual reminders that there is healing in naming and talking about grief, that while it does not make the grief any less real, it allows for that grief to heal and to be seen. So in this next slide, this visual right here is an example of one of the resources that we use in our product. And this has actually been the lens that I have begun to work through as a result of my own healing and growing journey as an as a SCRR fellow. In the past year, I've been able to give myself permission to slow down and to actually ask myself, how am I doing? But for real though, like, how am I really doing, right? What I realized was that the only way for me to lean into that was to truly practice this by asking it of other people, because I'm really good at doing it when I'm doing it for someone else. And so my goal was, every time I ask someone else how they're really doing, I'm also asking myself how I'm really doing. So whether this was after a staff meeting, seeing someone down the halls, or just a check-in. And I'm understanding more and more how the grief of the pandemic and post-pandemic of the last 4 years has impacted me greatly and has impacted those around me, especially educators. As educators, we are tired, we are tried, we are worn. That includes me. We are collective. We as educators did not get a chance to process the reality of the pandemic, but instead we were asked to shift to teaching in schools, to teaching over Zoom. And then when life went back to normal, everyone knew nothing was normal, and yet educators were expected to jump back into schools with the aftermath of symptoms from the pandemic sitting right in front of us, right? That is just the surface of accumulated grief. I was feeling frustrated with myself because I could tell that I was getting burnt out. And I was also getting burnt out and frustrated with others because I just was only seeing anger and resentment, right? And instead, I took a step back and I said, actually, none of this might be what's happening, but this is actually grief. So I began to ask these 4 questions. And when I had an opportunity to connect with fellow educators, this was why. The ability to name our grief is not only important to healing our present selves, but also to offer renewal to heal our future selves. One thing we as humans have in common is that no matter how we grieve, we share a need for our grief to be seen and witnessed, not fixed. David Kessler says this beautifully. Sharing our grief doesn't mean that we need someone to try to lessen it or reframe it. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of the loss without trying to point out the silver lining. Just being present in the same space, even without words, creates compassion and courage. When we can hear each other and we can see each other in a similar space, it can decrease our feelings of isolation, and we can remove the stigma that we have most often have been culturally accustomed to just ignore. When we are able to go against our current school norms, for example, when we can actually acknowledge that a crisis occurred, that someone died, that there was hurt and that harm existed, then we know that we can actually take that the harm will continue to exist and shift that unlearning. We're given a chance to heal through the pain because we give space for folks to just be human. We can provide space and witnessing to each other in a room and ask us these simple questions for pain and healing to exist, with the hope for recovery and renewal to heal as well. So this is still a conscious effort that I have to make daily in order to shift from my mindset of being a human doer to being a human being, which again, in full transparency, is completely unlearning my cultural upbringing of being a performance-based human to just being a human being at all. Kirsta, take us home.
Okay, next slide. This quote from Rachel Remen really sums up what being part of this project has been for me. Healing may not be so much about getting better as about letting go of everything that isn't you, all of the expectations, all of the beliefs, and becoming who you are. This project has really reawakened the passion I have for grief work and the craving I had for connection with others who feel the same. Our shared understanding, our openness, our humor, our desire to help really have validated where I sit with grief work, and the experience of the mentors, the speakers, the peers, all of that was humbling and enlightening. I really feel that I've grown from this experience. And I remember, what I want to keep remembering is that our humanness is our value. that our life journeys have merit, and that joy shared is doubled and grief shared is halved. I realized what a loss it is when we can't be our true selves because of preconceived notions about how a leader must act, of fear of being too much, and taken the words radically vulnerable to heart. I hope I can lead by example for others about living with my grief on my sleeve, so to speak. And it's let me expand my view of my role from someone who assists others in their time of crisis to one who sits beside them. I don't need to know all the answers. I don't need the perfect words or have certain letters after my name. I can be fully present with those in grief, and that's enough. I also really noticed in myself, and this is what I'm going to take forward, is that despite those words that I just said, and despite the value I put on living authentically and grieving visibly, it was very easy to keep the focus on what I could do for other people rather than be introspective. And so in looking at our product that we created for how others could work through grief, I realized that it's time for me to take more a look at myself. And I was so inspired by our other fellow members who really went deep into their own grief stories. And life is sending me messages that it's time to take that brave step myself. Yeah, as Dr. Remen says, I'm ready to become who I am. Yep, that's where we got our stuff.
All right. Thank you so, so much. I deeply appreciate the call to unlearn, right? That is standing out for me incredibly in the ways in which we are socialized to see ourselves, the ways we are socialized to receive information from our bodies, and really unlearning that so we can tap into our innate wisdom and the wisdom of the collective. This is a beautiful process. I invite folks to share in the chat appreciation, and we do have a few minutes to be in conversation. So I'm gonna stop sharing slides and just kind of let us all be here in this space and share any inquiry into the work that Canada, Christy and Christine engaged in, how this might mirror your experience in the roles that you hold, what's surfacing for you.
I see a hand up by Amy.
Oh, come on, Amy. Yes.
First of all, amazing. All of the presenters, just so, I'm like actually choked up at the gift that you're going to be giving, you know, your communities and your schools. Whoo, so good. I feel like from both of the presentations, like I'm taking away this idea of like unlearning untruths. Like that's such, and so I'm wondering, like, for you all, the three of you, what would you say would be your biggest kind of unlearning in this process, right? Of what you've had to let go of, and maybe what you're taking in as well.
Oh, I'll jump on that one because I just met Canada in person last week, and we both discovered we'd been widowed. I'm a very quiet and shy person, and I was an aggressive, I think that's the word, griever. And that was such a learning experience for me to really, it broke me open in a way where I felt suddenly okay to be loud about grief with other people. And I just can't describe it. I suddenly I knew what I needed. I asked people, like, please watch my kids, do this, do that. And it went away, you know, I mean, as time passed, but it was such a learning experience that the people who came to me and just sat with me and cried were so valuable. And so I learned that you can just sit with people, that you don't have to have a script. You don't have to have the right words. You can just be a person sitting on a couch crying with somebody else, but also that it's taken a lot of bravery to be that in public. And so I brought that into my school. You know how it is that we just go in and we keep working and we say, no, I don't need a break. I'm fine. I want my routine. I want this. To be able, as Christine said, to slow down and say, this is hard and I can't do it right now, isn't the culture where I worked. And so, Amy, I hope that fits with what you asked, because it's hard and it's brave and it's so important, such a good example for others.
I love this question too, for so many reasons in this process. It's interesting because the last 4 years well, I mean, for even the 5 years before that, but in my job in suicide, I have a lot of trainings I do on grief. I have shared my story with so many people. I think everybody in the state of Oregon knows my life story at this point. And I really, sometimes I was in space and really kind of processing and unpacking this with other folks. And I felt like I love that I'm able to sit in that and be that, but that's kind of what people always want to expect. And it's like I have more to offer. And so this was offering for me to be able to step in and kind of push against, like, sometimes we decide some people are healers, and sometimes we decide for different reasons, we might expect people, especially Black women, to kind of sit in those spaces. And though that may be real in my heart, I knew that I had other things to offer that were beyond just that work. And so it was definitely more of a risk to say, actually, I've been thinking about all this other stuff too. And to step into that. And so I'm always here for healing space, and everybody who knows me, and there's so many people in this room do, that is actually where this is rooted at for me. But I wanted to be able to talk about things in a way that just weren't focused necessarily on like me doing, healing work with people. And I do that stuff, and it's like free labor for folks. So how do I get to bring in other stuff and get them to think about that? So there was a lot of kind of unpacking that and kind of challenging people's expectations of what I should do.
Thank you. In the next 45 seconds, Christine, do you want to share what has been the biggest unlearning for you?
Sure. I would say for me, the biggest one is shifting my mindset from that professional training that I mean, first thing in grad school was what they started to ingrain in our brains, which was if you are talking for more than 10 seconds, then you're making it about you and not the client and not the student. And so it was this like complete actually a reinforcement for what my upbringing was culturally, of like, you keep yourself shut down, secrets are behind closed doors, you have to have it all together. And so this year I was hesitant to even apply for this fellowship because I was like, oh gosh, I got to tap into feelings. And it was the best F word I've ever leaned into, is all I'm going to say. I'm here for the feelings. So thanks, y'all.